We held kindly in Bayeux in Normandy an exhibition and to celebrate, as I say, our 10th anniversary. But it's also the Prix Bayeux's 20th anniversary, and that's why we're here tonight, to celebrate that. And hopefully you'll learn about the Prix Bayeux and a fair amount from our panellists. Now Prix Bayeux, by the way, is an award for conflict journalism, a series of awards for conflict journalism. But I'm very fortunate because I don't actually have to tell you about it, because here we have John Swain.
Hello.
Where's John Swain? Ah, John Swain. John Swain was, about 5 years ago, the president of the chair of judges. And we're extremely lucky to have him here to tell us all about the Prix Bayeux. Oh, you stand up, yes, please.
Good evening, hi. Well, all of you probably
But can you, can you put the microphone? Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I will. All of you obviously know about Bayeux because of the Bayeux tapestry, but I have to say that there is a very special reason to visit it because of this prize, which was started 20 years ago, the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings, and it has it was decided by the mayor of Bayeux and associated authorities to have a prize there because it was an appropriate place. Robert Capa, the great war photographer of the Second World War and other wars, had of course photographed the landings on the Normandy beaches. It's war graves all around from the Second World War. So it's a beautiful, beautiful city, and it every year has been holding this fantastic festival for war correspondents with associated exhibitions and prizes. 5 years ago, I was delighted and honoured, or delighted rather, to be invited to be president of the jury there, which therefore makes me president for life under sort of French terms, which is even better. But it is the most amazing, friendly, heartwarming festival. Is perhaps in a way the wrong word if you use it in English, because but it's a celebration of what war correspondents do in every possible way, their determination to tell the story that they see, to be a witness, and all those things. And of course some of them, all too many, have lost their lives. And that is also noted at Bayeux with a very moving ceremony once a year during this festival at a memorial where each year the names of those who've been killed during that last year of conflicts all around the world engaged in the trade of being a war correspondent, a war photographer, or a cameraman, television, all those sorts of things have been killed, and so it is a very heartwarming and very moving festival, but also with a lot of joy and a lot of celebration, which journalists are used to, and fantastic hospitality from the commune and the mairie of Bayeux. So, and this year I was there again, and it is one of the great things about it is that it is, although it's held in Bayeux, and it is a completely international festival, and there's an enormous amount of competition from journalists all around the world to try and win this prize, which has particular, well, I think, prestige, because it is the winners are selected and debated very, very seriously indeed by other journalists of different nationalities. And it's discussed, and their photographs were looked at, all those things, and short lists are made, and it's just done in a very rigorous and serious way. It is not, therefore, the sort of prizes that sometimes you get in awards, certainly in this country, where they're sort of shared out amongst the various newspapers. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying this. It's Buggin's turn this year because someone else got it last year. This is completely different and really just incredibly excellent. Okay.
John. Thank you very much, John. And there are a couple of things I want to add to that, because it's my job too, tonight. As you will all appreciate, journalists like the odd tipple, and so we're very pleased also to point out that the Prix Bayeux is conducted in association with the Calvados General Council. We also receive a little bit of support from drink suppliers, and are very grateful for it. The other thing, of course, which I think is worth pointing out, when we went out there in October, we actually saw this amazing tapestry, which of course we all know about. And needless to say, that was reportage, rather early 11th century reportage of our own invasion and all of that. Of course it was indeed, woven, I understand, by, our enslaved Saxon forebears, but anyway, so we all have a connection. It's a very close place, and the other thing about it, it's a medieval city that fortunately wasn't ruined by the bombing in the Second World War during the invasion. So it really is a unique place, and I think we all commend it to you should you wish to visit. I would like to point out, I'd like to, on behalf of all of us at the Frontline Club and the audience here tonight, I want to welcome two particular guests. Patrick Gaumont is the mayor of Bayeux, and he is with us tonight. So thank you very much. We're very lucky to have you. And also our tireless collaborator is Aurélie Viel. And of course, sorry for butchering every French word that I possibly can get hold of as a typical, Englander. And so thank you very much, Aurélie, for coming through. Prix Bayeux have organised a stunning photographic exhibition. Well, I don't need to say that because you can see it. It's on the wall here. And we're hoping they're going to forget it's here and leave it. And now all these photographs are, I understand, from actual winners of the award. And this is a 20-year-old award, so it's got a real pedigree. So we're extremely grateful to have them, and we'll try and get as many people to see them as we possibly can. Tonight, Prix Bayeux have brought an august panel to my left, and we're going to talk about them, their work, the journalism that we all do, and discuss it a little bit. And of course, we'll be open to questions so that you can grill us on why we do it and what type of people we have been. And also perhaps to look at the sort of changes that have occurred in war journalism over the last 20 years. And we have a panel who really know what they're talking about. And many people in the audience as well, so they can, I'm sure, chip in. We will have questions. I'm going to start off with Jeremy Bowen. Needs no introduction. He is a kind of doppelt winner of this award, by the way. I mean, he's, no ordinary man. A BBC Middle East editor and winner of the award in 2009 and another time for grand format television in 2012 for Gaza. And we're going to see that now. And what the way this is going to work is, Jeremy kindly, I haven't really asked him yet, but, he's going to talk a little bit about it afterwards for a few minutes, and to try to, he probably hasn't watched it for a long old while, so he'll be surprised by it, no doubt. Bring back all the memories. But now we're going to play, and if the others, when we do your bits, we'll do the same. Yes, excellent, brilliant.
Foreign correspondents started arriving. Israel had banned us from Gaza during the war. The fundamental cause of the war was the failure to settle a conflict that is a century old, and it's getting worse. Not all of Gaza looks like this, but lots of it does. Dr. Izzaldine says the girls were studying when their home was attacked. There were two explosions within a minute of each other. Dr. Izzaldine and his brother Abu Ahmed came rushing in here. It's where their daughters were. Bisan, the eldest of Dr. Izzaldine's daughters, was lying here. They lifted her out, but she died on the way into the next room. Gaida was there in the corner. They thought she was dead. Here in the centre of the room, the girls had been working at computers. In this corner, there was Maya. Her head was blown off by the blast. Bits of her brain are still on the wall and on the ceiling as well. You can imagine the force of the explosion. Aya was lying here. She was dead. And this corner was a little work area. Noor was here, dead as well. Her head blown off as well. It's a typical teenage girl's room. One of the terrible ironies of this, of course, is the fact that this was the family and this was the home of a Palestinian who had spent a large part of his life working for peace with Israel. The children and niece of Dr. Izzeldin Abouleish are buried together, close to their home.
Bisan equals 100 men.
Yes, and
This is my niece Noor. This is my aunt who was 15 years. And I was so happy that at least one of my daughters will be a doctor. I gave them the chance to select what they want to study. She said, I want to be a doctor. This is Aya who was willing to be a journalist. They have dreams.
The Abouleish children had already lost their mother, who died of cancer last year. Fragments of their lives together are left. His daughter Shada, who survived the attack, is making good progress in hospital in Israel.
They injured her eye. Takes time. Her hand, she can't write, right hand, but she's determined. And that's what she said to me. If they don't want me to see in my right eye, I will see in the left eye. If they don't want me to write in the right hand, I am starting from now to write by my left hand. We have to succeed, and we will succeed. We will achieve the goals that my beloved daughters, whom I lost, will be fulfilled by their living sisters and brothers.
The Israeli army says that during the fighting, 2 tank shells were fired after soldiers thought they saw Hamas spotters in the building. The doctor says it was quiet when the attack happened.
Jeremy, that brings back memories, no doubt.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was it was the aftermath of the 2009 Gaza war. I did that for it started. There were no foreign journalists actually in Gaza during the fighting. It started on the Israeli attacks that began, that phase of it anyway, were on, I think, the 27th of December. And so a lot of people were out for Christmas, quite frankly. So there were very few, there were some, but there were very few foreign journalists who were there. So of course, when the gates opened at the end, when there was a lawsuit by the Israeli Journalists Association to get correspondents into Gaza, because the Israelis were blocking us. And they succeeded in winning it, and I think as a result of that, we wanted to get into the story, and if you go in after it, I mean, clearly it's about the stories of what people went through, aftermath, and that particular man had this very tragic story, which actually had run very big in Israel, because he worked for many years in Israel as a doctor, and so he spoke Hebrew very well, and when the Israeli TV channels were on, rolling news, and he actually rang one of his friends who worked for Channel 10, one of the broadcasters there, and he put him on live from his phone very soon after. And so that caused, it was a difficult moment for the Israelis, funnily enough, because he was a man who had been not just a man who said he wanted peace, he went to work in Israel and spent a lot of his career working there, even though his family were in Gaza. And then this appalling thing happened to him with his daughters being killed. Appalling. And so that piece to camera, I thought, well, how do you put this over? I thought, well, one thing that struck me when I went around the flat was that the room was much the same. And I'd gone round with I mean, it sounds very cold-blooded at this point, but TV terms didn't quite work. And so we had very good stuff with him elsewhere, like at the grave, very strong. And so I thought, well, I could do this as a piece to camera. And so I basically had got the information from him about where they lay when he went in. And I thought, well, I'd just try and put it over that way. And I thought that if I put it in quite a factual manner, then it would have more impact. And also, I was, you know, it was, I'm sounding cold-blooded about it now myself, but actually, of course, it's horrendous. You go into someone's apartment and, you know, with him, and he explains to you what things you have to try and get them to make a strong impact in TV terms and journalistic terms. So, and I think it worked out in that sense, but it was, you know, as ever in the world of foreign correspondence, what turns into, I've said this a few times, but a good moment for us is very often someone else's worst moment or their last moment. And it was his worst moment, certainly it was the last moment of his kids. So we produced, I mean, this is one of the ambivalences about the job, we produced a powerful piece of TV reporting on the back of someone else's horrendous tragedy. I mean, that is one of the things about, one of the characteristics of our work.
How does one do that best? Because it happens time and time again, isn't it? You know,
The whole time.
we believe we have to intrude in people's misery to tell their story. How do you cope with that, and how do you manage to find the balance?
Well, what we do, and I think somehow TV is worst of all, because there are more people and there are cameras, and it's not like having a quiet conversation with somebody. It might be turning a light on them. The only justification for the intrusiveness of what we do, and we are very intrusive sometimes, you can be as nice as you like, but if you come across people at their worst moments, sometimes as well, as you all know, they are very keen to talk. It's not hard to make them talk. And he was very keen to talk, he's very articulate, as you saw. And I think the only justification is that old thing of bearing witness, of being a witness, of shining a torch into the dark corners of the world. And actually, because I do believe this is the only justification for it, I've testified recently in the Hague Tribunal on former Yugoslavia against General Mladic, the former military commander of the Bosnian Serbs. And it's the fourth time I've testified there, twice against Bosnian Croats, and against Karadzic and against Mladic. And some journalists I know aren't very enthusiastic about the tribunal because they feel that it's compromising. But for me, it's an extension of that principle of bearing witness. I think about those people whose lives we intruded on at awful times in Sarajevo and Mostar or whatever in Bosnia in the 90s. And I think, well, the only justification what we did there is that bit. And I wouldn't, in those testimonies, I didn't say anything I didn't report at the time. It wasn't like I was giving away secrets. But I think that it's a logical extension of the idea that you've got to be a witness to justify going and intruding in their lives, because otherwise, if you're not, you're a war tourist or you're prurient, and that's bad as well. But it's a hard line to cross, and you know, it is morally ambivalent at times.
Thank you, Jeremy. We're very lucky to have Christina Lamb here tonight, who's author and journalist at Sunday Times and received the Bayeux-Calvados Awards for written press in 2009. But we can't put that on the screen, so she's going to try and read something about it and also...
This is from Afghanistan in 2008, and it's an article that was called Mission Impossible. Last week I sat perched inside a Chinook flying over Helmand, trussed up in flak jacket and helmet, squashed between some Royal Marines arriving for a 6-month tour. Unable to talk over the loud rotors, some had earphones attached to iPods. Others, like me, had to make do with yellow military-issue earplugs and spent the journey watching the gunner scour the parched land below through the open back. For long distances, there was nothing to see but our dark shadow skimming across the desert. On the horizon was a camel train, perhaps carrying the opium that will end up as heroin on British streets. Temperatures can exceed 50 centigrade out here, and the one mud-walled settlement we see seems to be sinking into the sands like an ancient ruin. Miles and miles from anywhere, we fly low over a man with a cloth turban wrapped round his head and a small herd of ragged brown sheep. He does not even look up. What does he think about these foreign soldiers flying back and forth, I wonder? I wonder the same as we swing round into a patch of green trees and the Helmand River, swooping low over compounds where I can see colourfully dressed women and children. We have come to help them, but it looks like anger in their faces. The Chinook comes down to land in our own heavily fortified compound in the centre of Lashkargah, and the Marines and I jump out and run, trying to escape the burning powdery dust that gets in through the bandanas and goggles we all wear. 32 British soldiers were killed during the last 6-month tour, and I study the eager faces of the troops, many of whom are young enough to be my son, knowing that some of them probably won't make it back home. As I jumped out of the Chinook, lugging my kit, I wondered what we British are actually achieving in this faraway country, where all our previous engagements since our first military expedition 170 years ago have ended in disaster. That evening, I had dinner in the cookhouse with Brigadier Mark Carlton Smith, who had just finished his tour as commander of British forces in Helmand. He told me over turkey escallops and chips washed down with ribena that we should stop thinking in terms of defeat and victory. We need to lower our expectations, he said. We're not going to win this war. It's about reducing it to a manageable level of insurgency that's not a strategic threat and can be managed by the Afghan army. It was refreshing, finally, to hear some openly expressed realism. Over the past year, diplomats and military officials have been saying much the same privately. One Foreign Office official confided that he had written in a memo that Afghanistan was going to rats. Publicly, however, everyone still insisted on painting a rosy picture. With the fiasco of the war in Iraq, no one wanted to own up to the fact that it was going even more wrong in the land of the Hindu Kush. Carlton Smith's remarks were quickly dismissed as defeatist by Robert Gates, the American Defense Secretary. Back in Kabul, the sensation of the Taliban approaching the gates of the city has led to a frenzied fin de siècle atmosphere. Among the foreigners in their ever more fortified homes, every night seems to be party night, with people drinking heavily and bemoaning the fact that their cooks are leaving because they fear they will be targeted for working for foreigners. One night I even lay on cushions in a friend's garden drinking Chilean Merlot and watching Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull projected onto the back wall while surrounded by armed guards and barricades. It was odd to think that the Taliban were patrolling villages only an hour away, switching off music at wedding parties and threatening anyone who worked with infidels. I'm just going to talk at, because this, as I said, is long, but I met a man there who told me that he'd been looking after children in the province of Logar, which is next to Kabul, for 15 years. Orphans and those whose fathers had lost legs or eyes to the war that had gone on for 3 decades. This man, Bacha, made sure that they got to school, had something to eat, and had somewhere to sleep every night. After the fall of the Taliban regime, he started receiving international aid money. This enabled him to arrange a proper building, books, clothes, and occasionally even balloons and kites for the children to play with. 2 months ago, masked Taliban came to his house one night and accused him of working with foreigners and threatened to kill him if he did not stop. I was terrified, he said, but I look after around 200 children, arranged from 5 to 16, and I don't know what would happen to them if I stopped. So he went to the mosque and told the local community. It was a risk. Among those gathered for prayers were local shopkeepers and farmers who he knew donned masks at night and joined the Taliban patrolling the streets. The Eid holiday collection of 50 Afghanis per head, which usually go to the poor, had been commandeered by the Taliban that year. But the people beseeched him to stay. We need you to look after our children, they said. We will talk to the Taliban and ask them to let you continue. A few nights later, the Taliban again dragged him out of his house and told him he could stay as long as he broke off all association with foreigners. Bachar was not convinced. Now in hiding in Kabul with his 5 daughters and 2 sons, he said, maybe 80% they leave me alone, but 20% chance they kill me. The problem is I cannot trust the government forces to protect me. The police only want bribes from us. We are caught between the two.
Wow, well, I mean, I think that could have been written quite recently
Well,
from the
that's
manner in
what's
which it
really
predicted the
depressing.
reality. So, the British, obviously Carlton Smith spilled the beans, but the British Army currently have 101 press officers. Looking back at this whole embedding thing, do you think we did well as journalists? I mean, or have we been partially controlled? We're accused of it.
I mean, I was back in Helmand in July, and I hadn't been there for a while, and I was astonished at how restricted. I mean, I couldn't go anywhere, and probably most of you know, but I think it's outrageous that British journalists or any journalists going and embedding with British troops have to sign something called the Green Book, which means that every single thing you write or broadcast is first checked by the British military. That's why they have 101 press officers.
Not 101 journalists, that's for sure.
It's supposed to protect operational security, but it's a very fine line between that and censorship. And certainly early on in the British presence in Helmand, they were definitely using that to stop people reporting the things that were going on. And also, I mean, for a while they were stopping access for us to go there at all, and it was very frustrating. And I sort of feel that we failed in that we probably should have all got together and stood up against this and said no one is going to go there while under these conditions. Americans and other nations don't make you sign something like this. And I mean, people don't know. When I wrote this piece, there was nothing at the end saying that I'd written it under those conditions.
Do you think when you live with soldiers or live with a community, that how does one defend from bias? Because we get friendly with people, we have a reliance on soldiers. We were all accused, those of us who are in Sarajevo, many of us were accused of being biased and pro-Muslim. Is that something that you find yourself able to sort of deal with, or is it something that you're concerned about?
I mean, I don't just embed with the military. I go and travel with Afghans that I know and try and cover it from all angles. I think if you're just doing it from the military angle, what is unfortunate, and maybe we'll talk about more tonight, it is something that's changed certainly since I started, that a lot of these places are very difficult now to cover without embedding with the military. And you can't, we are now targets, so I can't just wander around Helmand. Now, before the British went in 2006, I spent a week in Helmand perfectly okay, travelling around, talking to people with no problem at all. It infuriates me when the British Army try and justify and say that, well, now you can go to Lashkar and walk around in the bazaar as though that's something astonishing. Actually, before you guys moved in there in 2006, we were walking around the bazaar. So it's very frustrating. And it's very depressing reading this piece because, as you said, it could be now. It was actually 5 years ago, and I just looked the figures up before I came, since I wrote that piece, basically saying that there was no way we could win and we should leave. 326 more British soldiers have been killed, 2,404 NATO soldiers, and at least 7,000 Afghan civilians. And you've got to think, I mean, what have we achieved? The figures just came out for opium for this year, showing there was going to be the highest ever crop. The security situation is dreadful. The elections, which may or may not happen next year, every single candidate or candidate's running mate is a warlord. And I'm not sure that that's what people thought that they were really fighting for.
Thank you to Christina. And I first met Christina in Pakistan in the late 80s. She really knows about Afghanistan, that's for sure.
We were both very young.
Okay, next we're moving to Neil Connery. Neil is a correspondent for ITV News. He's been an Africa and Moscow correspondent, and he won the Bayeux-Calvados Award in 2006 for work in Zimbabwe, which we are now going to see.
It is a wasteland, street after street after street, razed to the ground. It looked to me like a natural disaster. The hundreds of thousands who've been left homeless call this Zimbabwe's tsunami. It is no exaggeration. But man, not nature, is to blame for the destruction enveloping this country. The whole force of the state is busy destroying homes and lives. The government calls this Operation Restore Order. All I could see around Zimbabwe was chaos and trauma. There is no compassion here, only brutality, carefully executed. Even though there are still hundreds of police and security forces on the streets, I've been able to witness firsthand the sheer scale of the destruction of the past 2 weeks. So far, the United Nations estimates that at least 200,000 people have been left homeless. As you can see all around me, families have been shattered and livelihoods crushed. Every day, the numbers of those forcibly removed grows by tens of thousands. Once it was safe to do so, I managed to speak to the Chichewaza family, struggling like so many here.
We are very scared. We don't know what will happen. Such as now, it's now sunset. We don't know what will happen in the evening. Maybe they can come and chase us or burn what the remaining items we have now.
They show me the permission given to them by the government 4 years ago, allowing them to live here. It's worthless now. For so many here, survival is all that matters and holding on to whatever remains. At Hatcliffe Orphanage, they've been given 24 hours to get out before it's knocked down. Many of the children have lost their parents to AIDS, others are disabled. Now, thanks to the government, they're losing the roof over their heads. They've got nowhere to go. An orphanage demolished, the most vulnerable left homeless. How low can this regime stoop?
It was one of the most painful experiences I've ever experienced, and I was here during the liberation struggle, and I never thought I would see the day when this was happening to Zimbabweans.
It's late at night, and on every street, people are forced to sleep in the ruins of what they used to call home. In the suburb of Mbari, I meet Isaac, who shows me the conditions people are having to endure. And where do you sleep at night? Where are you sleeping? You sleep down here?
I sleep with all of them.
And where does everybody else sleep? Everywhere I went, people were bewildered, asking what they should do.
So if it is illegal, what shall we do? Because we are poor, we're not rich. So there's no any way we can get money.
While his country celebrates 25 years of independence, Zimbabwe's only president reassures Parliament that this operation is designed to crack down on illegal traders. But the opposition say it's their supporters who are being targeted.
I think the major reason is that Mugabe is very vindictive. They stole the election of 31st of March 2005. They know the extent to which they stole this election. So they are literally saying in their mind, you people, you don't love us, you don't care about us, we don't care about you, so to hell with you.
Even before the armed police and the bulldozers arrived, the people who lived here were desperately trying to eke out an existence. Now they're being forced into rural areas where starvation is already rife. This is the reality of life in Zimbabwe today. As the homeless find solace in the Bible, the church feels it must speak out to let the world know Zimbabwe's plight.
The greatest consolation of any human being is to know that I am not alone. And the greatest poverty of any human being is to know or to feel that I am alone. I've come to a point where I feel that as a nation we are alone.
As the forced removals continue, many Zimbabweans, like the Chichewaza family, feel abandoned. Another freezing midwinter night approaches with no home and no hope. Neil Connery, ITV News, Harare.
Well, that was, how did you get that, Neil? That was in 2006.
That was, yes, it was. I'd been down in Johannesburg for a few years then, and to explain, foreign journalists at that period were not allowed to work inside Zimbabwe. If you were caught there, you faced at least, 2 years, I think, in a Zimbabwean jail, which is not a prospect I think anyone would really want to seriously entertain. We had people up there who were telling us when these clearances started what was going on. One of the interesting points maybe we take on later is how, the internet is changing things in terms of the digital revolution today, how information gets out. But this was back 8 years ago, and things were much, tighter, much more control then. But we had some reports. We heard these things were going on. We weighed up the risks as we do in these situations, and we thought, let's go up there. Let's see for ourselves. And the team that we worked with up there had already managed to get some pictures together. But we wanted to see it for ourselves, to see, is this really true? Who is really being targeted? What is the scale of this? That figure of 200,000, actually within, I think, a month, the United Nations was saying 700,000 people in total had been affected. I was surprised when we went up there by the scale of it. And although I'd been up there before, the real danger in that period was being caught. So you were very limited in your filming opportunities, hence so many pieces to camera in cars, which really gets annoying, but it's better than being caught. And really just trying to bring home to people what we could see on the ground. I mean, this debate tonight is how things have changed in 20 years. The digital revolution is fantastic, and I'm sure Jeremy will talk about this in terms of the Middle East and the Arab world over the last few years. Being able to get reports and information out from people is fantastic, but having people being able to get in there and give it context and to stand back from it and to piece it together, I think there's no substitute for that. And I hope that the team, I worked with a fantastic team in Zimbabwe and Johannesburg on that report, and I hope we did justice, as Jeremy was saying earlier, to the stories that we heard and the misery that we witnessed.
Thank you very much. And finally, we've got, I'm going to butcher his name again. Adrien Jolm. Is that? Come on, tell me. How do we pronounce your name?
Not bad at all. Yeah.
Adrien. Adrien is a reporter for Le Figaro and winner of the Bayeux-Calvados Award for written press in 2007. Now, he's French. The article's in French. So we have a slight problem here. We can't put it on the screen. So, Adrien, what did you write?
Well, the title was probably the best part of it, and I'm very proud of it. The title was A Short Walk in Iraq, because I did embeds like we all did, as Christina was saying, because at one point it was impossible to drive around Iraq. It was the years 2006 and 2007. So I've spent like weeks and weeks and months with different American units, and I remember I was ferried from one place to another. The names were totally cryptic. I was fly off at night in an helicopter from LZ, Washington to DZ, Liberty or some place. And I was living in this sort of parallel world, where only young people, men, women, American women, were, working, obviously very busy, talking this strange language and everything. And it was a complete disaster. I had no story at all. It was in the middle of a war, an important war in the Middle East, and I had no story. So I was talking with my editor, and he asked me, but where were you? You were in Iraq, right? I said, no, I was not in Iraq. I was never in Iraq. I was in another place. And I remember because the two books I was carrying with myself, it was pre-Kindle era and a very unfortunate period. But I had this field manual from compilation from the General Petraeus of all the crazy ideas of all these French officers during Indochina, Algeria. Total madness, right? And I had Alice in Wonderland, which is my favorite book. And the two books were extraordinary because all the lessons of this this universe were there. You're mad, I'm mad, everybody's mad, otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? And I said, right, okay, so I was not in Iraq, where was I? And I started to write to describe it as, me falling in a rabbit hole of this totally impossible to understand universe, parallel universe, because I've been to Iraq quite a lot of time before that, but this time, during these several trips, I barely met any Iraqi. I'm not even sure, I didn't get an Iraqi stamp on my passport. I landed in Baghdad. It was not Baghdad, it was LZ Liberty or something. Then I took a night flight to LZ something, and then I was transported. I was living in this air-conditioned universe where you were eating different flavors of ice cream with, and tacos, and it was an extraordinary thing. And it was just totally well. So I tried basically to describe it, I was counting, I remember I was counting in the fridge the number of different ice cream flavors you could get. I was counting in the PX what you actually could buy. And I was trying to describe this entire thing. So I'm quite glad because this, apparently it succeeded to convince the jury, which, well, the price is long gone, but I'm still very grateful to them. So, yeah.
So you don't like American ice cream?
I do love it. It's very good. No, the
Grape ice cream.
Well, no, but I mean the major. I mean well, it's a bit, embarrassing to say, but I think amongst the many disaster which happened recently to the war reporting is booze have totally disappeared from campaigning armies, that's for sure. So you are actually fighting with Gatorade or different, it's terrible.
That is deeply problematic.
Yes, it is, yeah. Well,
thank you, Adrian. Now, time's pressing, and I want to start a discussion between us about, I think, probably the most pressing issue, which of course is journalism safety, because I think the risks to us have increased hugely. John was talking about the memorial at Bayeux. There are nearly 1,900 names on it from 1945, which gives you some perspective on the price that is being paid for this information. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to open it to questions so that everybody has a chance to find out from these wonderful people exactly what they want to know. I'm going to start with you. How would you perceive these increased dangers? I mean, the BBC will now send you very often with bodyguards, really. How dangerous do you perceive it to have become?
Well, I first went to a war in El Salvador in 1989, and I feel that since then things have become much more dangerous. The reason is that there was a chance back then to be treated as a non-combatant. It certainly was the case in that trip to El Salvador. I was absolutely amazed when people who were based there and spent a lot of time there showed me how they had white flags they'd wave and they'd shout periodista, journalist, in Spanish. And I was getting all set to sprint across the road. They said, no, don't sprint. Walk very slowly, carrying a flag and waving it. If you sprint, they'll shoot you. If you walk very slowly, it'll be okay. It seemed very against one's instincts to do that. And that was still the era when journalists wouldn't have flak jackets in the main. I certainly didn't have any safety training. Nowadays at the BBC, even someone who's been doing it a long time like myself has to go for compulsory retraining or refreshers every 3 years. We're not allowed to travel. Maybe that's a good thing, not being allowed to travel. So it's different. I mean, back then we looked in a shop in Washington, D.C., where I was working at the time, to see if you could get a flak jacket, and they sold these metal things that SWAT teams of that era would wear going into a room. It weighed a ton, they were very expensive. I thought, I can't wear that, and it's very expensive. So I packed as I said, I'd never been to a war, I packed my running shoes, because I thought I'd do a lot of running. It was quite, sort of true, and I was lucky enough to work with a very experienced Salvadorian cameraman who showed me the ropes, really. But I think that the advent of the wired together world, 24/7 news cycle, means that people are much more aware of the need to win the information war than they would have been back then. We're all much more visible, whether it's through a screen for print journalists, whether it's through the TV. But the thing is that dangers don't come necessarily from people who've even seen what you have produced. The idea has grown that if you're in a lot of places, sadly, and the area where I work in the Middle East, it's quite common, this idea that if you're a foreign journalist, you're some kind of spy. Quite recently, some of the jihadist groups in Syria put that out to their people. They said, treat every foreign journalist as a spy. And that makes life really quite difficult, very difficult. And so I feel it's much more dangerous than it was then. Of course, wars are always dangerous. And I don't think, however much training and experience you have, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, then you can be killed. But it's helpful to be experienced. But the thing is now there's this extra, and I feel it particularly in the countries I work in, where it's a strong anti-Western thing. and even in, say, in poor parts of Cairo, I would be very reluctant to go to them. I mean, not because there's shooting or anything going on there, but because if the minute you get the camera out, you're surrounded by a group of people accusing you of manipulating, of lying, because they've heard all this stuff from various propaganda outlets themselves. And it's very, very hard to work sometimes. It's very hard to work as a result of that. So that's how I think things have changed enormously. People want to impinge on the news cycle sometimes, and the way of doing that can be to knock off a journalist.
Christina, Marie Colvin, Syria. I read there are possibly 17 journalists as hostages in Syria. How do we cope? How do we cover Syria? Has it got too much?
Yeah, it's very depressing. I mean, John Swain and I are both colleagues and friends of Marie, and Sunday Times, who I work for, has not sent anybody in with the rebels since then. So you could argue that we have not covered it properly. We've just had somebody on the regime side. It's now got to a stage where almost nobody is covering what's happening. And it's very frustrating. You see all the situation, all the people being killed, innocent people, and you can't go there. And I feel personally, I feel guilty not to be able to go. But it is just too dangerous. And as Jeremy said, I guess we started about the same time. I started in Afghanistan in '88. In those days, the biggest challenge for me was logistics, getting the story out. There were no phones in Afghanistan. There were no direct dial phones even in Pakistan when you got back. So you were trying to find a telex or something to send the story back. And if people got hurt, and people did die, you were there at the time, but it was mostly bad luck and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think it's a great irony. We wear these flak jackets that say press in white letters across the front, which I keep saying we should stop wearing, that we wear them so we are differentiated from the military. But actually we're seen as targets, maybe even more than the military now, because basically, if you kill a Western soldier in Afghanistan, for example, it doesn't really even get mentioned on the news now, whereas if you kill a journalist, it still does. So I actually think we should be wearing camouflage jackets the same. We shouldn't be, because we're sticking out even more. I think that's really sad that has happened, and it makes it very hard to report. We're a bit different because I'm print, Adrian, as well. So I can be a bit less obvious. I don't have to go around with cameras and lots of people, and I still think that the safest way is to be very low profile, to be, travel in an old battered taxi, not have people with me, and sometimes being a woman, particularly in countries, again, I keep citing Afghanistan, but I could wear a burqa. My Afghan friends tell me that the moment I walk in it, I'm very obvious because I don't walk like an Afghan. I sort of stride along. It's easier for me to be low profile than it is for
we
you
stick out
guys.
like sore thumbs in the TV business, and we do occasionally have these so-called security advisors with us that you mentioned in your question for, and who are ex-soldiers who they can be very useful and very good, and in some places it's not appropriate to have them. Having some ex-army guy with you is not a great idea. I personally am more of a fan of working with local people and using local knowledge as much as you can. I think it's the best way to keep safe.
Neil, they're replacing you with a drone, they say. Well, are they going to replace us all? No, seriously, there's this idea that drones can somehow help us gather news and reduce the risk. Do you think that's realistic?
I just want to pick up on one point. When we talk about war correspondents and journalists who are killed and injured, there's sometimes an understandable concentration on journalists from Britain and Europe or the Americas, who go to places and things happen. The vast majority of journalists and people involved in news gathering who are injured or who are killed are locals. They are locals to that country. And they're not only journalists in terms of how we operate, especially in television, drivers, translators, all the people who help us do what we need to do we as an industry have a huge moral responsibility to those people, as well as ourselves and our own teams. And I just wonder whether we really deliver on that as much as we need to. I mean, I know there are some, all media organisations take this very seriously, but it's just a point worth making, I think, sometimes, that we can look at it from a British perspective, when actually we go to these places and the people who are living, they have families there, they're the ones who, we get on a plane and leave.
Freelancers. I'm a freelancer, and I'm not really on the panel. I'm doing this job. But Adrienne, what's your paper's view on freelancers with regards to Syria? Because of these 17 hostages, the majority are freelance.
Yeah, and a lot of them are French too.
A lot of them are French too.
Yeah, so, well, Syria is very, but I think, what Jeremy and Christina just said is exactly what happened. I mean, before recently, the risk was a matter of statistics, which is not a small thing, but it's, you're there, you're sharing with people living into a war with an exit ticket, that's for sure, but your duty, your moral duty is to share, at least during the short period of time you're there, is to share the dangers, otherwise it's voyeurism, it's terrible. But when you suddenly become a target, it means walking in the streets of a big city and you're sort of beaming thing where it means money and reward. This is something totally different, and it changed totally the rules of the game for us. But totally. So yeah, in Syria it happened in a couple of months or something, right? So then it started to someone said that foreign journalists were spies, and instantly, I'm talking about weeks or something, then, dozens of colleagues have been snapped. And
in this country, as a freelancer, I get the sense that the industry slightly wrings its hands about freelancers. We can't really work it out. How do we use them? How do we not? And they're gathering a huge amount of what we get in Syria. How do you guys do it? What is the reality for the French freelance?
I don't know. I'm staffed since a couple of years. Started as a freelancer, and then I was hired probably because I was starting to cost too much, beginning to cost too much. But I've been in Aleppo several times, and the paper decided. Nobody really wanted to go after that, and no, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And some really good friends have been kidnapped there, and it's I think it's a silly thing to do, for the moment.
Questions? Anybody? I've got a question here. Can we have the microphone? Please introduce yourselves and try and direct your question, if you can, to one of the panel.
Hello, I'm Lizzie. I'm a designer. I don't have anything to do with this, but just interested in it. Just following on from what Jeremy was saying about whether it's okay to intrude on someone in one of their worst moments in order to reveal a greater truth, but also what you're just saying now about there being an increased risk to yourselves in going to these places. Has there ever been a time when you feel that you've put the person that you're talking to at risk just by your mere presence and by talking to them and them talking to you?
Well, I've often wondered if we have. I don't push people to talk. If they want to talk, they can talk. I tend to think people can make their own decisions. Sometimes we fuzz out the faces, blob out the faces, but modern technology can unblob things, I think. Occasionally I've spoken to people and said to them, do you really want, we're filming this, we're filming what you're saying, people in Syria and things like that. Then we're going to Deraa from Damascus on the regime side, and these kids came out and were just, quite openly lambasting the regime, saying how they wanted to kill Assad. And I'm saying, we're filming you. We'll put this on the TV. We don't care. But we did blob their faces out because I thought, they were just getting carried away. But they still wanted to do it, and so that was the compromise. We blob them out. It's a very difficult thing to know. I think if you operate openly, you tell people what their contribution is it will be on the news, you will be on TV in a couple of hours, then I would give people, quite often might try and disguise their identity if they ask for that, film them from behind or stuff like that. So it's, I hope I've never directly put anyone in danger, but sometimes people are aware of the risks they're taking, and if they say against a particularly nasty dictatorship, sometimes they want to take the risks. And you know, I've had people saying to me, "You will insult me if you don't use this. I make my own decisions." So, it's a difficult area.
I think, we're often reliant on the bravery of other people to speak out. Zimbabwe was a good example because it was illegal for foreign journalists to go there. So anybody speaking to a foreign journalist was doing something illegal. And I was always amazed at how many people did want to speak. But sometimes I do think we have a responsibility to hide people's identity, even if they say they want to speak out, because sometimes people get caught in the situation and don't think. I was just in Iran for a couple of weeks and talked to a whole lot of students, and I said, what should we do about names? And they were, yeah, name us, please, we want people to know. And I said, well, you know, what you're doing, you're not supposed to be talking to foreign journalists. You're all talking against the regime and the situation. And you really want your names there because they can come after you. And the situation in Iran at the moment seems freer. But, you know, a few months ago it wasn't, and it could change back any time. So actually, I took the decision because I didn't really think it mattered. Again, it's a bit different print, TV. Didn't really matter to the readers of the Sunday Times what the names of these people were, but they had said to me, we're happy to be named, and I didn't think it was worth that risk.
Question over there, please.
Hi, I'm Minu, I'm Iranian. Can I ask two questions?
Of course.
One is, Christina, thank you for bringing all these things, particularly from Afghanistan, to our living rooms. And it's really wonderful work you do. But why is it, I didn't know that you have to sign a green book. So why is it that right at the bottom of your article, you couldn't actually just say that I've had to sign a green book, whatever? Why is it that we don't know that?
Well, that's a good question. I have argued with my editor that I think we should disclose that, and they have not agreed. I guess because no other paper or news outlet. I don't think that's a good excuse. I think somebody should
it's terrible
doing it. Because it is censorship, and you know, if we report, when we were reporting illegally from Zimbabwe, we mentioned the fact that we were not able to speak openly. When it's actually our own troops, we're not saying that.
Thank you. And Jeremy, I've always wondered if how you keep impartial between when you're reporting in Palestine and between Palestinians and Israel, and whether you've ever been accused of siding with the Arabs.
I'm constantly accused of not being impartial. I've even been accused of it by the BBC once. I try and stay impartial because I think that you have to have some credibility as a reporter, and you have to. People need to believe what you're saying. I have strong views of my own, of course, but I think that impartiality doesn't mean saying. In fact, my esteemed colleague, Alan Little, did a film about impartiality for a BBC training course. They had a good budget, and they were in Sarajevo. And they went, I know, really, license payers' money. And they went to Sarajevo, and he told this story in a bar, and he said, okay, this is impartiality. You're in a bar, there's a fight going on. You say to the barman, why are they fighting? And the barman says, well, that man says 2 + 2 = 4, and the other man says 2 + 2 = 5. Now, if you're reporting it, you wouldn't say the truth lies somewhere in between. You'd actually have to say the one guy's, this makes more sense than the other answer. So I think being impartial doesn't necessarily mean that you just do on the one hand, on the other hand. You actually have to try and take the audience by the hand a little bit and point them in the right direction.
Another question now, please.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm from the Lamp and Owl, Birkbeck University. My question is to Jeremy, basically, further to your comment about the intrusive nature of the camera during interviews. With the advent of the smartphone and the development of apps that put basically a darkroom into the hands of freedom fighters and or terrorists, is there potentially a problem on the horizon regarding the authenticity and validity and authenticating the images that are being broadcast?
Well, I think everybody who works in TV will know that this is, it's already, there's a big problem about the authenticity, and there have been some celebrated cases where people have put video out saying this is, I don't know, Aleppo today, when it's in fact Baghdad 4 years ago. At the BBC, we try very hard. We have people who work full-time on trying to authenticate videos, and because we have the language services, we have people as well who they might contact, they'll know that there's someone working in BBC Arabic who might come from Homs. So you say, well, here's the video. Does this look like Homs to you? Yes, I recognize that street. And so they try and do things like that. But the provenance of this stuff is very difficult because it has really changed things. We've been able to get some remarkable information and images out of, Syria recently. I mean, that chemical attack on the 21st of August. I sat there, I was in Cairo, I did the pull-together piece for the 10 o'clock news from the BBC that night, and there was just, I was sat there watching these things all afternoon, and you'd have had to have been Steven Spielberg to fake it. I mean, it was so real, and there was so much, it was overwhelming volume. So I thought, well, this is not a fake, but sometimes it's a lot less obvious than that. And I do think that having these videos around makes a difference. If in 1994, I was in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, and there was not much of an international response to it, frankly, in terms of stopping it happening. Had people been able to upload material from their phones, on their phones at that time, onto the internet, of people being hacked to death at roadblocks and things like that, and piles of bodies, perhaps the response of the world might have been very different to the one that it was. So, on balance, I think it's a good thing. But as journalists, and in TV, you've got to be very, very, very super careful.
Questions? Yes, we've got a question there.
Hi, I'd like to ask Christina in particular about the risk of sexual assaults towards female correspondents in particular. I spent much of this year reporting in Egypt, and Jeremy mentioned, getting out the camera and the risk to that. But I found that, when you're trying to report from particular protests, sometimes it's almost impossible to go out because of the risk of sexual assault. So I was wondering, in your experience, is this something that we're just more aware of and we're more open to talking about, especially after Lara Logan's sort of much publicised attack? Is this a situation that's got worse, or are we just talking about it more? And, how have you tried to combat these sorts of issues?
It's a really good question. I mean, I've spent most of my career working in the Middle East or countries where women are often hidden away. And people have said to me, how could you work in these places as a woman? And I always thought it was an advantage because I could meet both sides, women and men. And I also thought women were actually treated with more respect and we were less likely to be kidnapped or anything happened to us. I think that's totally changed. So I don't think, there always was an element of risk if you were in big crowds. And I spent a lot of time in Pakistan in the early 90s. And I always covered myself very much and covered my head and didn't wear provocative clothes at all. And I've been astonished sometimes at some of the Western female journalists that come out, maybe for TV, they have to do it a bit more, but not just TV, who are out in these places wearing low-cut things that really show their figures, and you just think you're just asking for trouble. But I do think that the situation has definitely got worse, and Egypt I have not reported from, but I've heard really bad stories from colleagues of it being a place that is now really hard for a female journalist to operate in. And I don't know why it should have got worse, but it certainly does seem to have done.
Adrian, do you think it makes a difference? Who's out there really listening? Do you ever worry about this? Apart from the good burghers of Bayeux and the people in this room, Do you think our work really makes a better world?
Well, it's a very important question. I don't think it changed. Well, someone actually asked a question once to a president friend of mine, and he had this very interesting answer. And he told me it doesn't change much, but without the international report, it would get really worse. So he was saying that basically it won't make their life, much better, but without it, it could get really, really worse. And I kind of agree. See what I mean? It doesn't really. Journalism never stopped the war, or maybe, but after a long time. But it can sometimes,
But has anybody on the panel really thought that any story we've ever done was really worth our lives?
I have to say, it's been very depressing listening to all that, because every single one of the stories that won an award, the situation has not improved. It's got worse. Mugabe is still there, Iraq, Gaza. And so when I was watching your report at the beginning, which I remember, that report was so powerful, and you were talking, and I was thinking, well, we do it because we want to make a difference. But actually, none of this has changed. And that's really, that's what you hope that you're doing it for.
At least there's a reckoning, though, in a sense. I think if you come out with the information, then at least people can't say, well, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know. If only someone had told me, I'd have done something about it, a politician might say. Well, you could say, well, actually, no, we did report it. So therefore, you did know what was happening. And I mentioned the War Crimes Tribunal. That's one reason I'm quite glad to have testified there, because there was actually a legal reckoning. And things I did as reports 20 years ago were admitted as evidence. So I was glad of that.
Two very quick points. I saw Mugabe at the elections in July and managed to catch him for a few words at a rally. And he's 89 now, and I asked him whether he'd still be in power in 5 years' time. And he actually challenged me to a boxing match to prove how fit he was. And I know there's plenty of people in Zimbabwe who would happily take him up on that offer.
We'll go back to the audience. There's a gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Declan. I work for a medical NGO, so I'm probably quite obtuse to much of what you're talking about. But following on from what you mentioned there about to what end is this achieving, when people see you as foreign correspondents, is there an expectation that it will deliver something because you're foreigners? And then is there a letdown when that doesn't happen, or have you felt that?
Who wants that one?
I remember a brief trip into Syria last year, meeting some rebel fighters who kind of said, what on earth are you going to do that, hundreds who've come over, what's the difference? And you do feel, our job isn't to affect change. Our job is to capture what we see. Well, because our job, we're not agents of change. All we can do is capture and say to all of you, that's the best, that's what we've seen, that's what we've heard. We're with you in that process, but our job isn't to affect change, I don't think.
You're an agent of change, aren't you?
Secret agent. I remember at the beginning of the siege in Bosnia in 1992, in Sarajevo, people were very welcoming to camera crews, journalists who turned up, because they'd say, oh yes, the world will come, you will bear witness and the world will come and save us. And then, after about the first winter, people would say, well, when's the world coming then? We'll give you one more chance, and yes, we'll do that interview again, but I'm getting a bit sick of you lot. And by the next year, there were no-go areas in the city, places where you get your equipment and your flak jackets and your cars stolen, because they were so fed up with foreigners, they wanted nothing whatever to do with us. And so this idea that, tell us everything and your lot will get better. When it doesn't get better, people do see through it quite quickly. So it's there's been some research about so-called real-time journalism and whether or not it does change things. And I know there are academics in the field of journalism in here who will know it better than me. But I think there are some cases where it does. Certainly, I've heard people are very aware of the news cycle if they're policymakers. I did a book about the Arab uprisings, available still from all good bookshops, and solve your Christmas present problems. But it's. I was talking to a bloke in the Foreign Office very senior, and he was involved in a lot of the policy making about Britain's response to that sort of crazy period in 2011 where an awful lot of things were going on. And he said, I would watch Sky News at 6, and I'd listen to the Today programme at 7 in the morning, and I knew that if there wasn't anything big on 6 or 7, then we'd have a fairly okay morning. But I knew that if there was something was leading those bulletins, I'd have the Foreign Secretary on the phone to me by 8, asking what we were doing about it. And because certainly those policymakers are, I think there's strong evidence, are absolutely wedded to the news cycle. And they have their TVs on. You go into their offices, they've all got their TVs on the whole time, tuned into the various 24-hour networks. So it's influential in that sense. Whether it changes things, I don't know.
Panel, I mean, we're obviously all perfect, but you know, it does occur to me, what makes a good war journalist? I mean, you know, our colleagues are clearly often quite dysfunctional. What is it that makes a good war journalist?
I don't like the term war journalist.
Oh, I'm glad you said that.
I just think, you know, journalists are journalists, they're storytellers. And, you know, yes, if all you did, you know, was go to a war zone after war zone after war zone after war zone and nothing else, I think that would warp your view of everything. I think you need a broader perspective as possible, I think.
Yeah, I'm not very happy with that term, a war correspondent. It always makes me cringe a bit. I think that the qualities that make a good journalist in those kinds of difficult war situations is the same qualities that actually make a good journalist anywhere. No matter what kind of journalism you're doing, you have to be interested in people. You have to give people a sense of what it's like to be there. You have to be empathetic. You have to be accurate, quite fast. But there's this extra dimension, which is it's dangerous. And that is a constraint. It provides friction in what you're trying to do, and also can kill you. So that is something which you, of course, have to bear in mind. But basically, I think the skills of journalism and the requirements are the same in whatever story you do. I don't think it's different.
I think you have to be very determined because you're mostly trying to get into places people don't want you to be in.
That's true.
And very curious about what's going on. Yeah. I actually, when we were just talking about, you know, whether we make a difference or not, which was depressing, Zimbabwe, which has been an incredibly depressing story to cover because it's gone on for years and it's hard to cover because the situation is not very visual, apart from Moran Botswana that you reported, but it's a sort of general long repressing of a people and lots of people just leaving the country, but not in refugee camps, coming into places like here and getting jobs. And I got very fed up with kind of going back and forth, and my editors weren't very interested. It was hard to find a new way of covering it, but I felt passionately that people should know what was happening there. And at one point, I ran into a really brave woman, some of you may have met or heard of, called Beatrice Matetwa, who is a lawyer in Zimbabwe, who is trying to document all of the things that Mugabe has done. And I said to her, because she said, when are you coming back? And I said, you know what, I just don't think it makes any difference. And she said, if you guys stop coming, what will be the point of what we're doing? We're trying to change things. And if people outside don't know, what is the point of us? And that really, I always remember that when I get kind of disillusioned.
There's been a sort of a real look at some of the stress, the levels of stress that journalists can acquire as a consequence of this work. I was really wondering whether that progress has also happened in France. Are you guys now focused on trying to account for all our divorces and, you know, our PTSD as a consequence of the work we do? I mean, have you guys made progress on this?
Well, I'm not sure actually. It's also part of the religion, so you shouldn't touch this thing. No, I'm joking. It's, but I totally agree with what you were saying. I mean, the creative war reporter, it doesn't exist. I mean, reporters are sometimes covering war, but it's a bit like, you know, when you do mountain climbing. I mean, the higher you go, the most dangerous it gets. But technically, it's not very different. It's just you need to be fit, to do your job properly. But the consequences can be more, you know, lethal potentially. But yeah,
because I think it's been quite a struggle for the industry here to get to a grip with it. But I think we have. When you say, I think we have sort of grown up about this thing. About how do we actually deal with it. And it's interesting that the military are quite advanced as well on managing managing PTSD, and we seem to have grown up. I'm going to go back to the audience. Have we got any other questions? Yes, please. Sorry, can you wait for the microphone? Sorry, otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. I recently read a summary of the laws that have been enacted to make war illegal. And I would think in this century it was the Kellogg-Briand Pact after the First World War, and then, of course, there was everything around the Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg Principles and the Rome Statute. And I wondered, it seems to me that war, with all this legislation over this last century, is illegal. So do you feel there's a role for you to expose the illegality of what our countries are doing? I'm Canadian. And the fact that they are engaging generally in an illegal activity. I wondered if you feel you should be exposing that more, or would that be editorializing? It seems to me that 2 and 2 does equal 4, and several laws do.
5, isn't it?
Truth lies somewhere in between.
Thank you.
I think that the whole body of international humanitarian law is a very useful template for measuring stories. I contributed to a book that was published about, at least 10 years ago, called Crimes of War, that Roy Gutman, and several other people put together. And the idea was that they get journalists to give illustrations of different war crimes that they'd witnessed as a way of explaining humanitarian law. Because he said, when he was selling the idea to me, he said, look, you go to a place and you see maybe they've turned a hospital into a military position, it's being attacked. I mean, do you know what the law is on that particular thing? Is it still a protected building? It's not, actually. If they put a military position on it, you can attack it. And so I put something into that book, and I thought it was a good idea because it's quite it's a measure you can put against things. For example, these concepts of proportionality. Is it a proportionate? It'd be useful in reporting what's been going on what goes on periodically in Gaza. Is Israel's response proportionate to the damage or threat that they've faced? And it's not just a rhetorical device. There's actually a body of legality there. And even though these things are not often enforced, it's, I think, a good thing that if we hold it up, it's a bit like a measure you can put against things that you see, against stories that you see.
Can I just make a very quick point? When I said that our job isn't to affect change, I know some people down there shook their heads. The point I was trying to make was that we're not elected by anyone. We have, and once you start going down the road of trying to affect change, well, what kind of change, on whose behalf? That's the danger with seeing your job in that role. That's why I personally have very clear limits on just trying to capture what we can see and to put that out to people, and then that's where a process, if it starts, would start.
Do we agree with that?
I don't agree with that. I mean, if you see something really shocking and outrageous, of course you want to change it. You want people back home to know and to do something about it. You're not just reporting it because that's your job to do it.
But I mean, in a philosophical way, clearly that's the motivation of what it's to capture it. The point I'm trying to make is that you can see the dangers if you pursue that. You can be seen as taking sides ultimately in conflicts, can't you? The best way is to bear witness, and that is the most powerful way, I think.
Yes, but you're bearing witness because you want people to see something shocking and that needs to be somebody should do something about. You're not just bearing witness dispassionately.
Neil, don't you get down the route of ending up with inappropriate balance invariably? He agrees. Excellent. Okay, we've got a question from the back there.
Yeah, my name's Nick Bashel. I'm an artist, and I've worked in some of the war zones. And as an artist, I was extraordinarily privileged to work within the military camps for months at a time and had access to information that no journalist could ever get, because I was just an artist. So I could, I wasn't a threat. But what did strike me was that they had information. They had briefings every day, twice a day, from all branches of the military and civilian operations there. Brits, I'm talking about the Brits. And over a period of weeks and months, you began to realize how much information was at the disposal. Not in addition to stuff you never heard, which was presumably all the Secret Service stuff or the special branch stuff. And this information was fed presumably to the generals, who then made their decisions, or who then advised the policy deciders back in England. And my question was that journalists have access to information that the military don't get, presumably, and in many arenas. And sometimes, how much are you asked to advise policymakers? You referred to policymakers earlier. Are you ever asked to go and see them individually, and do you brief them? Are you ever asked to? And would you?
Who's up for that one? Policymakers.
What was the saying? Too many journalists thinking, no, too many diplomats thinking as they were generals, too many generals thinking they were diplomats, and too many journalists thinking they were both, or something like that.
So who's come back and briefed the politicians and the generals after a trip? Anybody?
I've never been asked. I've had conversations with them, which is sometimes a bit interactive, with, say, people in the Foreign Office, where they tell me something, I might tell them something. But
it's a fishing trip, really.
Yeah, but I think they're a bit too proud to ask us sometimes. And by then, I've normally told 250 million people who watch the BBC around the world every week. So there's nothing. I've got nothing left to say. Anything interesting I've found out, I've already broadcast. So it's all out there. There's no secrets.
There's no working together.
Not really. No, they sort of feed. British diplomats abroad are quite good at giving you briefings and things like that, and it's very helpful. And if I've been somewhere, say, on the street level, which they wouldn't be able to get to, I might say, well, this is what they're saying over there. And that's, over a gin and tonic or something. But no, there's nothing really all that formalized, I'd say, not in my experience.
Christina, it sounds like they should have talked to you before they went to Afghanistan.
I mean, I have been asked to testify to parliamentary committees and talk to people here. Because also I find, a lot of our diplomats now are, because of the security threat, don't go out and talk to people. They live behind these concrete walls and they don't go anywhere. So actually they don't have a clue what's going on. It's difficult because, I wouldn't want to start giving information about individuals but a lot of it is a sort of two-way conversation where they'll discuss with you what their views are on things. I mean, it's like meeting a source, really.
I don't want to run over. We've got time for two more questions. A question there and a question there.
I know that Ian and Christina disagree about the whole idea of whether journalists should bring about change, but I think that the important thing is that, there is a difference between reporting and propaganda. And if we, for example, with Syria, when, the time of when there was potentially going to be a US strike on the Syrian regime, there were some journalists who were in favour of that. There were some journalists who weren't in favour of that. I don't think that's our job to say whether it is. I think it's our job to say this is what is happening on the ground and not put our personal opinion on it. Because also, it affects your credibility as a reporter. And when people read your reports or they watch your television packages, they will say, yeah, but he's for the regime or he's against the regime. And so they won't trust you. And I think that trust in a journalist is kind of what we do this for. People trust us and they trust our work and what we do. And I think that we should try and keep that going.
But if they trust us, aren't our opinions valuable?
I mean, one distinction with broadcasting, of course, which is regulated in the UK, there is a duty to impartiality. The press has more leeway in terms of its interpretation. It doesn't have that, despite recent efforts, doesn't have the regulatory pressures needed.
Now, this, of course, is a debate that journalists debate all the time. It's hardly fresh tonight, I regret. Nevertheless, we'll keep on debating it. The question over there.
Yeah, so my name is Luke Abbs, and I'm a PhD student in conflict analysis. I just had a question about whether there's bias in the types of conflicts or certain countries that are reported. So maybe in reference maybe to the Democratic Republic of Congo, it seems to receive less attention than other countries.
Why is that? Jeremy, you've done that.
I've never been. You've got a former Africa
Who's done the Congo?
I've been to Congo for years. I haven't been there for 10 years or more.
Adrian.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you read a daily newspaper, one magazine, and watch some good TV channels like the BBC or some, you may have heard about what was happening in Congo during the past 10 years. So there's a saying in different journalism awards. There's always, I don't take it personally, but there's always someone say, well, why don't we never talk about Congo, which became sort of a joke. It's true that if you just watch the but not very carefully the news, you probably not heard about anything about Congo. But if you're a little bit informed, do a bit of reading, you've probably heard what was happening in Congo because it's important. It was quite well covered. It's a difficult country. It's a big country. But I mean, I know a lot of journalists who have been there and we've been covering it quite very decently. So I think Congo have been covered, probably not as much as Afghanistan 2001 or Iraq 2003 or Syria 2013. But it's because there is big news and there are big news and there's the agenda is agenda. But
have we covered enough? Well, in your country,
you never
maybe more than we have there.
You never cover enough, but what I'm saying is, things are covered. I mean, if you read one or two newspapers, one or two magazines, watch good TV programs, you get information available about Congo.
All right, we're going to do one last question, one last question.
Sorry, my name is Chantal Daniels. I work for Christian Aid, and I actually cover the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm very sorry, and I'm not going to ask a question about that. But hasn't journalism become a reflection of what we see in everyday politics at this moment? Isn't that one of the reasons why we never hear anything about the DRC, but that is the reason why we hear something about Syria, about Mali, about Afghanistan?
Reflecting, not challenging?
I mean, I think it's our job to put the things on the agenda, not just cover them because they're in the politics. Of course, I mean, Congo probably gets covered more in France, I suspect, than here, because it gets very little coverage here. We tend to cover things more that we're involved in, so...
so that South America hardly gets covered in this country. Certainly not on TV, only a bit.
So there are all sorts of conflicts you could say that we're not covering, and there are also conflicts we are covering that maybe we focused on the wrong thing. I'm sorry to keep going back to Zimbabwe, but the focus of British journalists here for ages was on the white farmers. Now, I think 18 white farmers were killed, and actually hundreds of thousands of black farm workers were tortured and lost their lives. And you would not have known that for a long while we were even covering people's pets being killed, before we were covering that. And that's dreadful, and it totally played into Mugabe's hands because he could say, this is the British colonialists who can't bear seeing their countrymen lose their farms.
One thing I'd say is that, there's a lot of coverage of the Middle East. And I've got an interest in that because I'm Middle East editor of the BBC. But I do think, and people often say in Israel, people say, why are you so interested in us? There are so many foreign correspondents here, we're only a small country. But I think in the Middle East there is a sense in which some of the tectonic plates of world culture and economics, there's oil, there's religion, strategic positions, it all comes together. And there's a historical interest in this country in the Middle East. former colonial power and so on. So I think that that's why things seem to be a bit more immediate, and that's why they get more of a focus. And it is a function too of the level of, say, of diplomatic and political activity about what's going on. I've just been covering the Iran meeting in Geneva, and I wouldn't have gone if those foreign ministers hadn't turned up. It looked like they were about to sign a deal, which they didn't do in the end.
But very quickly, I mean, we share those frustrations as well as journalists, because we've all, one time or another, had an editor on the phone, and we're trying to convince them this is the story we need to be doing. Let's go there. Let's do this. I mean, there are budgetary pressures. There are other stories. There are a whole range of other things going on. So we do share that frustration often.
Journalists, I'm so sorry. All right, I'll give it to you. So persuasive.
Because the expression is like, if it leads, it bleeds. Which I've read a lot. And if you do have these other stories, is it not possible for you to publish them independently on your own blogs? Or and I don't know if you do that, you might do that, and then you're going to turn around and make me look like an idiot. But
I think it's if it bleeds, it leads, actually. It's that way around. Certainly helps to have a bit of blood to get it on the screen sometimes, with some stories. It does. I don't publish for other things because I'm wholly owned by the BBC, so I couldn't.
But you have a limit on time. News bulletins are so long. I'm not an apologist here. I'm just trying to. Those are the kind of decisions, trade-offs that editors every day, and even themselves, is not an exact science. You'll see disagreements, very heated discussions between journalists in newsrooms going on between, look, we should be leading with this. No, this is more important. I mean, those tensions. That's our daily bread and butter that we all deal with.
I have to slightly start wrapping this up now. I mean, on behalf of the panel, I'd like to thank our audience for being so interested in coming tonight. So thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists for coming to the Frontline Club, supporting it as they do. But most of all, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank the Prix Bayeux, because it's a really splendid award, and we're extremely grateful for it. So thank you very much.